And I'd like to, first of all, express a very good morning, a good evening, good afternoon to all our colleagues who are tuning in this evening. It is indeed a pleasure for us to start this series of webinar in fulfillment of this important undertaking, which we have been requested, the Secretary General of the United Nations has been requested to do by the United Nations General Assembly, and that is to recommend in his report in September the possible development of a multi-dimensional vulnerability index for small island developing states. I'm aware of the interest that is surrounding this matter, and I'm also cognizant of the fact that this is an outstanding matter in the mind of many small island developing states, and of the crucial need for us to do all our best effort to ensure that we will be able to come up with a good sets of recommendations. And this is the first of such series, and I would like also at this stage to welcome the speakers who are going to be presenting to us during this first technical webinar series. And on that, I would like to express a warm good morning and a good evening to Professor Lino Bugrulio. Of course, Lino is not a stranger to this process. In fact, he was one of the early hand that started this conversation, and we are very fortunate indeed that he has agreed to come once again this morning to kickstart our discussion, and a very special welcome to you, Lino. I also would like to acknowledge and welcome in our colleagues who are participating from headquarters of the Asian Development Bank. I know it's odd hours in your part of the world, but I would like to specifically acknowledge Jan Hansen and Rosalind, Ms. McKenzie, for your presence, and also to thank you for agreeing to present to us this morning. And of course, also we have Mr. Jacob Asa and Mr. Riyad Medeb, our colleague from UNDP, who have always been very supportive of the small island developing states, and of course of this process. And we are thankful that they have prepared a paper for our consideration, and they will be speaking on this today. Now, basically, what we are trying to do here is to hear from those who have, in one form or another, work on a multi-vulnerability or some kind of an index that may be applicable to small island developing states. This technical webinar series are a fact-finding sort of platform, and information that we gather from this series will be used to elaborate and to assess and then with a view to a possible sets of recommendations to the General Assembly. So it is important for us to know, of course, the reasoning, the objective behind the work that has been done, and of course the target of the potential use, and all those important aspects of it we would like to hear from today. And as Ms. Thomas said in the introduction, there is a lot of room for discussion here, frank and open, and his dissent is encouraged, because that will only prove to solidify and to strengthen the matter that we are trying to come up with. And we do really hope that at the end of this technical webinar series, our colleagues from the Office of the High Representatives of landlocked and least developed, landlocked and small island developing states will have sufficient information from our technical work to give regular updates to the member states who are not participating in this technical webinar series, but very much looking forward to hearing from us the update and the latest development in our conversation. So with those few words, I would like to thank you very much indeed. And Ms. Thomas, let me give back the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sai, for your words. We're going to jump right in. I will just remind all colleagues, please ensure that your mics are muted. And at this time, we will ask only the presenters who are speaking at this time to ensure that their video is enabled and their mic is ready to go. We are going to start with the gentleman in front of us. His name is Professor Lino Briguglio. As I indicated, he is no stranger to this discussion. Many of us probably already know him. Lino is a professor of economics from the Islands and Small States Institute of the University of Malta. Sue, can you bring up Professor Briguglio's presentation, please? And Lino, over to you, please.
Okay. Okay. Okay, I'd like to thank the SIDS unit for inviting me, especially Sai, and the assistance I got from Anya and Susanna in the preparation of this presentation. Now, can the presentation be enlarged a bit, please?
Sue, hit slideshow.
Yes.
Right, hit slideshow and then news and hit slideshow, and then from
yes,
the beginning.
Please, we can.
From the beginning, Sue.
Yes. Okay, so the presentation, as we'll see, has 7 sections. I will dwell mostly on section 4. So we can go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Next. Okay. All right. Next. So this is some background about the index. Next, please. No. All right. So we can go to, we skipped a few slides there, but doesn't matter. Now, the introductory slides were mostly related to the origin of the index in 1994, when in the Barbados Program of Action, in some of the articles, there was a call for the drawing up of this index, because it was felt at that time that SIDS were registering a fairly good income per capita, mostly were in the middle income, and therefore almost excluded totally from concessionary finance, whereas we knew that they were very exposed to forces outside their control. And I started this presentation, although we didn't see it, by emphasizing this very point. And I'd like the audience to keep this in mind. The objective of the index is not to measure poverty. There are many indices measuring poverty. For example, the most common one is GDP per capita. This index was intended from the very beginning to measure forces outside the control of the country, that is, exposure to adverse shocks, to adverse external shocks. So we have to keep in mind that this is the objective of the index. Now, originally, there was a meeting at the UN to discuss the call for the index in the 1994 meeting. However, the index ended up for the least developing countries and not for SIDS, actually. So this is a little bit of background. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is why we're here today, to respond to the call in order to discuss this multi-dimensional vulnerability index. Next, please. Okay. Now, as was said already, I was involved in the index and I published quite a few papers on it. And in the next slide, I will discuss very briefly my view of how the index should be composed of. Next, please. Okay, so in order to measure exposure to external shocks, I always insisted that trade openness should feature in the index. It's true that trade openness is good for development, but this is not the issue here. The issue is not whether it's good for development or otherwise. The issue is whether it makes a country exposed to shocks, to external shocks. Also, export concentration is very important, and I'd like to insist here that export concentration should not only be on merchandise, as the LDC, as another index which I will discuss later, I included export concentration, including services. The reason is because most SIDS exports are concentrated on services, not on merchandise. Now, dependence on strategic imports, mostly food and fuel, and proneness to natural disasters. Next, please. Now, these are the 4 indices. Next. Next, please. Okay. And when I go back, please, edit. When I actually computed the index for about 180 countries, I think, there was a clear pattern that the smaller the country is, the higher the vulnerability. Now, I'd like to make a point again here. We did not need an index to prove this point. That small states, island states especially, are highly exposed to shocks is intuitively, logically so, but the index as computed strengthens this point actually, okay? So there is intuitive reason and also empirical ones. Next, please. Okay, now, a point that I also like to emphasize is that if the index is to be operationally useful, it should not include variables which are, let's say, self-inflicted. You cannot go to ask to claim you are vulnerable when the situation is self-inflicted by yourself. That's why I insist on the term external. So features that are self-inflicted by bad governance, including instability. I will come back to this. Instability may be the cause of bad governance and not the cause of external exposure to external shocks. Next, please. Next. Okay, so I discussed 2 indices that I came across recently. One I suppose will be discussed later, which is the Undp Index, and the other, the Caribbean Development Bank Index. I will gloss over them very briefly. Next, please. Now, the Undp Index is, let's say, a development on the so-called CDP index, that is the index used for graduation or otherwise of least developed countries. Now, I think it makes very useful additions to that index. However, I think it has two weaknesses, obviously, just to my mind. One is that it includes export instability, and I will discuss why later. But briefly, export instability is not a cause of vulnerability, it's a manifestation. The cause really is openness, because you can have a very unstable country, not because it is vulnerable, but because it is badly governed. And the most unstable countries actually are large states. If you get Singapore, which is highly exposed to shocks, is not unstable because the governance is very good. You can get a large country which is not highly exposed to shocks, which will be then very unstable. So I will criticize the Undp Index on these 2 points. Otherwise, I think there are items in it which I would add myself if I could find the data, which is the financial vulnerability. Now, as regards the environmental vulnerability, I think that the exposure really comes from two external factors, comes from disasters, not from agriculture and fishing, but that's a matter of debate. Next, please. Okay, I discussed this. Next slide. All right, now the Caribbean Index includes trade openness in it, so that is the plus I consider the index to have. However, it includes what is social vulnerability. I will refer to this later, but basically the weakness of this is not a vulnerability factor. In fact, SIDS are more socially developed, the most socially developed among developing countries. In fact, social factors and SIDS are one of the best points that they can show. And in any case, it's a policy factor, so policy-induced factors should not feature in a vulnerability index, which should only cover, I think, inherent factors which render the country exposed to external shocks. Next, please. Okay, I discussed this. Next one. Okay, now, I'd like to focus on this one if I have the time. Okay, now, next one, please. I'm going to say here in this section that there are some points that one should keep in mind when a vulnerability index is to be computed and developed. Firstly, we should not include self-harm in a vulnerability index, which is intended to make a case for SIDS that they need support from the donor community. So the argument should be, that is the argument by the small states, we were born like this, it's not our fault. We are exposed to adverse shocks. We did not self-inflict it ourselves. And these are the reasons. So that is a cardinal point, that the items included, the variables included, should be inherent and not due to policy. Next, please. Now, we should also distinguish between the cause and the effect. Instability of whatever is an effect, a manifestation. The cause of exposure is not the instability. The instability is the effect of the exposure. The cause of the exposure is really the openness of the country to various things. Okay, and that is what happens in Barbados and Singapore, in Malta, Mauritius. I'm referring to the, let's say, successful small states here. Whatever happens there is determined by forces outside their control. The reason why they succeed is because they adopt policies to withstand this adverse effect from outside. And I'm going to talk about this later, which I call resilience. And I think the resilience factor explains why some small states succeed, and when compared to other developing countries, very often you'll find the small states, or most of them, in the upper section of the developing world. Next, please. Now, we should also distinguish between vulnerability and resilience. And the distinction I suggest to be coherent, and we don't duplicate variables in each, we assign vulnerability to inherent factors, and we assign resilience to policy-induced. So if I refer to Singapore again, Singapore is highly exposed. I would think because of for example, the pandemic, Singapore would be affected much more than larger countries. So there's the exposure. But Singapore has a set of policies to withstand or recover from these factors. So it's very important to stick to inherent factors. Next, please. Now, if the index is going to be used to make a case for SIDS, we should not include in it strengths, even if the social factor is inherent, which it is not. There's nothing inherent in education and health of small states. However, even if it was, it will weaken if we added, in fact, the Undp index did not add social variables, possibly because it is a governance issue, and also because it weakens the argument that SIDS are vulnerable. But I would reject the social index mostly because it is not inherent. Next, please. Now, also, we have to set the objective very clearly. Why do we need an index like that? And why was it included in the Barbados Program of Action and given a lot of importance? First of all, I'd like to say something which I hold very strongly. The donor community accepts that small states are highly vulnerable. I used to, attend many international meetings. I never heard somebody from the developed world, making a stand against this index. Most of the stand came from other developing countries. I know because I was at one point even involved in the negotiations. Now, so the objective should be for small states to make a case that even though they are not poor, they cannot show a picture with a boy with saliva coming out of his face and flies with a big tummy. They cannot show a picture like that because most of them are not poor, really. So they don't have a good case. All right, there's a case for poverty. And there are small states that are really poor. I agree with that. However, most of the small island states, their case for support and for attention is that they are exposed to shocks. So that should be clearly in our mind. We're going to show that they are poor, but we're going to say that their development options are highly limited, and if they don't have the right institutions, they will almost fail. In fact, the small island states, I'm not going to mention them, where their institutions are weak, are almost failed states. Among the almost failed states, there are some SIDS, but then some SIDS are on the top part of the, let's say, on the top half, let's say, of the developing world. So I think we should insist that the objective is not to show that they are poor, but to show that they have limited options and they need support to avail themselves of these options. And I insisted always, as did now, the most important need that they have is to build the institutions, the right institutions. Next, please. Now, the next one is that when we construct an index, this is with reference to the Caribbean index. We should not compare only, include only SIDS. We should include all the countries in the world because we have to compare, okay? That's not an important point, but this refers to the Caribbean Development Bank Index. Next, please. Okay, now there is this bone of contention. In fact, I had a lot of discussion with the persons who use the LDC index, the index used for the least developed countries. Trade openness was excluded because the experts on the other side said that it is good to be trade open. Of course, it is good. But this does not detract from the fact that countries are compelled, small states, they don't have an option. The local market, that's why I consider it, I call it quasi-inherent. Okay, there is an element of policy in it, but small states must look beyond their domestic market. They don't have a choice. If you look on your domestic market only as a small state, you're doomed to extinction. Even the poorest SIDS have to look outside their shores. Now, once they are compelled to look outside their shores to sell their products to, let's say, whatever, including tourism and financial services, once there is this compulsion to do it, then a small state will be open to forces outside its control. It does not have the option of not trading. It doesn't exist, okay? Next, please. Now, I developed this acronym, which is STAR, and I like to insist to explain them briefly. First of all, the index should not be convoluted and in a way that only the developers of the index can explain it, okay? So it has to be not simplicity in the sense that it's easily understood. It should be transparent, so the data should be available. It should be affordable. I mean, you don't have to spend, you have to do it as frequently as possible, okay? And it has to be reproducible, replicatable. So anybody who wants to try it out, even to criticize it maybe, or to appreciate it, should have the data available, and it shouldn't be too complicated. So I think one of the important things for the index is that it is easily followed, so that even those who support the index will know what they are supporting, or even those who are criticizing it will know what they are criticizing. Next, please.
Professor, can you wrap up?
Yes.
Please?
Yes, I'm going to wrap up. 2 minutes. Now, in the next slides, I'm going to say that it is important that there is an insistence that vulnerability for small island states is a reality. It has been proved over and over again. What is needed really, even though we're going to make it, let's say, multidimensional, by including, for example, the financial variables that the Undp referred to, the most important thing now is for small states to build their institutions. For example, I mentioned Malta, although Malta at the moment is not mentioned for the right reasons, but the economic institutions in Malta are very strong competition policy, and so Malta is resilient to external factors, but Malta was lucky to be in the EU. In the EU, the first thing that the EU did for Malta and Cyprus was to strengthen the institutions. Now, because of the indivisibility problem, that is per unit costs in a small population, having institutions is very costly. If you want a competition authority, you need lawyers, you need economists, etc. It's very costly. So I think the objective of the index should be clearly set that this proves that we are highly vulnerable for various factors. Vulnerability requires the right governance to withstand the shocks and to recover. The right governance requires, as a sine qua non, important, institutions. The institutions are costly. If we have the institutions, we can build our resilience. So the support from the donor community is not to say how unfortunate are the small states. No. The argument by the donor community is say the small states are highly exposed to shocks and we should help them build their institutions. And this is where the small states, small island states, should clamor from the donor community. And the most important objective, therefore, is to build resilience. And when the vulnerability index is placed on the agenda, it should be tied all the time with the need for resilience building. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that presentation. And colleagues, we will make all presentations available on DESA's website after, so fear not, you will have access to these very interesting presentations from pretty much immediately after. We're going to save any questions. Please keep your questions. Please keep your questions. I hope you've written everything down that you want to question or comment on. We're going to move straight into the colleagues from the ADB who are joining us at some odd time. Professor, if you can you close your your camera, and we would ask the colleagues from the ADB to, thank you, and Guillaume, if you don't mind.
Yes, please. What?
Oh, you're okay. Gotcha. So we would ask the colleagues we will hand the floor over to the colleagues from the ADB who is joining us at some strange hour of their time. And before you have two very esteemed panelists who will introduce themselves to you. Please, over to you, colleagues.
Anya, thank you very much. I'll ask Jan if he could come on video as well, just so that everybody knows what the team looks like from ADB. So I'm Rose McKenzie. I'm a Principal Operations Coordination Specialist in the Pacific Department of ADB. My focus is on fragile and conflict affected situations in small island developing states. I'm joined today by Jan Hansen, who is Senior Policy and Planning Economist in the Strategy, Policy and Partnership Department of ADB. Now, we're very grateful to UNDESA for bringing us into this conversation and the webinars. We will be joining as many of these webinars as possible. The concept of an MVI, a multi-dimensional vulnerability index, is extremely pertinent to the work that we are doing. ADB is not a builder of indices, but we are an active user. We currently use the EVI and are very interested to see where these discussions, these fact-finding discussions, as I referred to them earlier, will lead us. So we use the EVI for purposes of resource allocation under the ADB Asian Development Fund. The ADF. ADF provides grants to ADB's poorest and most vulnerable developing member countries. The 13th replenishment of the ADF was concluded earlier in 2021. And under ADF 13, ADB used the EVI for the first time as a resource allocation tool for ADF grant eligible developing member countries. Now, in the interests of time, I'm going to hand over at this point for Jan to take us through his presentation on exactly how we use the EVI as that resource allocation tool. So thanks. Jan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rose, and thank you very much to the organizer. Thank you so much to Sai, to Anya, and thank you very much to Professor Lino for this extremely interesting presentation, and thank you also to Jacob. Rose already introduced me. I will try now to upload my slides, and I'm asking Anya if you can see my slide.
Yes, it's perfect. Go ahead. You may want to run the slideshow, though. You have the entire thing there. So if you click on slideshow, which should be in the toolbar, and you should be able to run it from there.
Okay. Not this one.
Right, there you go.
Okay, please let me know if they are not moving, the slides. The objective of our presentation is to outline the application of the Economic Vulnerability Index to create an economic vulnerability premium for SIDS during the Asian Development Fund 13 cycle. As Rose already introduced, the ADF, which is ADB's largest special fund. It was introduced in 1973 to mobilize concessional resources for the poorest and least developed member countries of ADB. It was initially a concessional lending facility that did not provide grants. ADF grants were introduced in 2005 to better respond to the needs of heavily indebted developing member countries. The ADF became a grant-only facility in 2017, while since then concessional lending is financed from our balance sheet. ADF 13 was adopted by the ADB Board of Governors on 27th of November last year for a total replenishment size of about $4 billion, and it will cover the period 2021 to 2024. Okay, I hope the slides are moving now.
Yes, Jan, they're moving. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Out of 13 ADF eligible developing member countries in early 2021, this is basically what you can see on the slide. 10 DMCs, the 10 developing member countries are SIDS, and 7 are fragile and conflict affected situations, or FCAS countries, of which 6 are SIDS. That means that the only DMC in ADB, a developing member country in ADB, which is eligible for ADF grants, which is not a SIDS, is Afghanistan. The ADF strategy 2030 is recognizing SIDS as requiring special attention on account of their unique development challenges. Supporting FCAS and SIDS is also one of 6 areas of special attention of the ADF 13 to respond to the main challenges in the poorest and most vulnerable developing member countries. The COVID-19 pandemic basically started during finalization of the ADF 13 replenishment process, which and SIDS have been among the most affected. While the short to long-term social and economic impact of the pandemic on the region remains still uncertain, the effectiveness of the ADF 13 strategic and resource allocation framework has been considered as adequate and flexible enough to respond to the crisis, including building the foundations of an inclusive and sustainable economic recovery in concessional assistance countries. One major reason for this is the economic vulnerability premium for SIDS, which is based on the EVI, and I will get into that soon. This slide is just showing the general structure of the ADF 13 grant framework. It has basically 2 pillars, one of country allocation, and the second one is support for thematic priorities. And it also has a private sector window on a pilot basis and contingencies. The core of the ADF has always been the performance-based allocation system for concessional resources, which is widely applied among major multi-development banks. And it's very popular with donors, in particular because of its clarity and transparency. The Pba formula, which I believe many of you will be familiar with, is a weighted geometric index of the composite country performance rating, per capita income, and population. It is guiding the relative volumes of concessional finance that eligible countries are allocated. By giving a major weight to performance in the performance-based allocation formula, the Pba formula is seeking to reduce poverty by enhancing the effectiveness of development aid, directing ADF resources to good performers and creating incentives for improved performance. It aims at balancing needs defined by GNI per capita, population size, and ability to utilize resources defined by the outcome of the country performance assessment as a proxy for institutional capacity. The country performance is measured using various dimensions contained in the country performance assessment, which ADB is carrying out once every second year. A greater weight is provided to the governance cluster of the indicators in the CPA. This means that a country will be allocated more, the better are its institutions. The greater the population and the lower its income per capita or the higher poverty. As most FCAS and SIDS have poor institutions, they will be allocated relatively less from the overall resource envelope in the PBA system. Having said that, in summary, the PBA system is widely used among MDBs. It is favored by donors of concessional finance due to its transparency of a formula-based approach and reliance on a limited number of key development related variables and its reward of improvements in capacity. But, and this is now critical, there are some very clear limitations in the PBA system for SIDS. The PBAs for SIDS are generally very small, mainly because of their small population size. And it is actually not offering sufficient resources to meet the SIDS needs for key development programs. The PBA system therefore has to be modified to increase allocations for SIDS and to ensure sufficient financing and build resilience and address the causes of vulnerability. In the past, different arrangements in the past ADF cycles, we have tested different arrangements to increase the allocation for SIDS outside the PBA system. Including, for example, a base allocation, which we applied under ADF cycle 12. This has effectively increased allocations for SIDS, but because it's a uniform amount for eligible countries, despite large countries receiving substantial performance-based allocations, makes the base allocation not really an efficient meat to allocate scarce grant resources to SIDS. Instead, vulnerability and fragility indices can be integrated in the ADF resource allocation framework, and to provide a tailored supplementary allocation for SIDS based on the degree of vulnerability of eligible SIDS. Now we are coming a little bit, I wanted to discuss briefly the characteristics of indices. One major constraints of using vulnerability and fragility indices as part of ADF, our ADF resource allocation framework, is limitations in country coverage. With regard to fragility indices, we have actually not been able to identify comprehensive fragility indices, which are covering all grant eligible SIDS. They also tend to reflect a wide range of indicators relating to political, economic, and social aspects, as well as experts' qualitative analysis in some cases, which also makes them complex, increases the complexity of their methodologies. We have therefore not, in our in our study so far, I mean, all of these are now tentative results, which I'm discussing. We have so far not been able to integrate existing fragility indices for these reasons in the ADF resource allocation framework. Among 3 vulnerability indices, the EVI, the Climate Risk Index, and the World Risk Index, it is only the EVI which is covering all ADF grant eligible countries. The Climate Risk Index does not cover Nauru, and the World Risk Index does not cover SIDS, does not cover 4 SIDS. The Climate Risk Index country ranking is very narrowly focused on disasters, and it tends to, it is very volatile, change drastically according to whether actual disasters have occurred in any particular specific years. The World Risk Index is consisting of 27 indicators, which makes calculation very complex and prone to the issues of data collection. The EVI, just to summarize it, is considered. The EVI is considered, has been considered in our work to be the most suitable vulnerability index for use in the ADF resource allocation framework to develop a supplementary allocation of ADF grant eligible SIDS based on country coverage, data availability, simplicity, and comprehensiveness. It's covering all 10, ADF eligible countries, including all SIDS, and it measures the structural vulnerability of countries to economic and environmental shocks. The EVI, very important, is also relatively stable. As you would know, some of the parameters, like for example, remoteness from world market and share of population in low, elevated and coastal zones, does not significantly change over time. This means that updates of scores would not risk to cause significant fluctuations in resource allocations from one ADF cycle to the other, which is a critical feature of vulnerability indices to be applied for resource allocation purposes in order to ensure stability and predictability of allocations. There are basically 2 options to amend the resource allocation mechanism based on vulnerability indices, which we have explored. And the first one is integrating vulnerability indices into the Pba formula. And the second one is determining the size of a premium for SIDS outside the Pba system based on the vulnerability indices. The first, I thought, just to summarize a little bit the tentative results which we have been able to come up with. It has this first approach means that we integrate the index in the Pba formula. The Pba formula is basically augmented by a vulnerability index, and then it's possible to assign different weights to the vulnerability index, and also in comparison to the other variables which I mentioned before. It has emerged that integrating vulnerability indices in the Pba formula cannot fully address major shortcomings of the Pba system, meaning that it doesn't really help to provide. It doesn't really help to ensure meaningful resource. Allocations of a meaningful size or amount for SIDS. The simulations of the Pba formula, including vulnerability indices, generally show that several SIDS may receive substantially higher allocations, while, however, allocations for other SIDS, especially those with a small population, remain very small. Interestingly, the simulations also demonstrate that the nature of vulnerability of SIDS is fundamentally different from the vulnerability of Afghanistan, which I already mentioned is the single other remaining FCAS country among ADF grant eligible countries. There is no vulnerability index which can be basically included or can be used to augment the Pba formula, which would ensure a meaningful, a substantial allocation to both the SIDS and Afghanistan. So in summary, our tentative results are that integration of the vulnerability indices in the Pba formula does not ensure sufficient resource allocations to all ADF grant eligible SIDS. It creates a wide range of country allocations among SIDS, and it cannot replace the special ADF allocation, which we are currently providing outside the Pba system to Afghanistan. So I'm now approaching the last part and the conclusion of our presentation. As I mentioned before, there is a second way of including vulnerability in the resource allocation mechanism. This has turned out to be the preferred approach, and it has and it means introducing a premium outside the Pba system for ADF grant eligible SIDS under the ADF 13 to provide a tailored support based on the degree of vulnerability, as it is through an economic vulnerability premium as it is measured by the EVI. The SIDS, in order to determine this economic vulnerability premium, the SIDS are divided into groups based on the EVI scores. You can see that here in the table. So as you know, the EVI is scoring between 0 and 100, with a higher score indicating higher vulnerability. As you can see in the table, the methodology of classifying SIDS by their EVI scores, the table shows the classifications of the SIDS according to their scores and the amounts which are allocated to the SIDS based on the economic vulnerability premium based on their classification. The highest group is comprising scores between 70 and 80, and those SIDS which are mentioned here in the table are allocated an amount of $55 million for the entire ADF 13 cycle, while the lowest group is comprising scores between 40 and 50, with an allocation of 40 million over the cycle. The allocation of the economic vulnerability premium is limited to ADF grant eligible SIDS, because other ADF grant eligible countries already benefit from substantial Pba allocation. For them, the Pba system works. And by that, we can just jump quickly to the conclusions here of our presentation. Introduction of an economic vulnerability premium has shown to ensure more adequate allocation for the SIDS to build resilience and address the causes of vulnerability. Secondly, indicative ADF grant, that is the result of introducing the premium, is that indicative ADF grant country allocation for SIDS during the ADF 13 cycle amount to 576 million, which is about 28 of overall country allocations for ADF grant, and it is 46% higher than what we were able to provide for the SIDS under ADF 12. The EVI finally is considered to be the most suitable index, vulnerability index for use in our resource allocation system because of coverage, country coverage, data availability, simplicity, comprehensiveness, and also robustness. And by that, I finish my presentation. Thank you so much. Over to you, Anja.
Thank you very much, Jan. And I will ask that everybody saves their comments for the discussion. We're running a little behind time. So we're going to jump right into the colleagues from UNDP. Jan, if you can turn off your video and unshare your screen, thank you. We'll just jump right into the colleagues from UNDP. Jacob and Riyadh, please do introduce yourselves before you begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Anja, and thank you for UNDESA for inviting UNDP to present its discussion paper. So my name is Riyadh Medeb. I'm the Senior Principal Advisor for Small Island Developing States in UNDP, and I'm joined by my colleague Jacob Essa, who is an economist and policy expert and statistician in the Human Development Report Office in UNDP. Our discussion paper is a contribution to the process which is led by UNDESA and OHLLS in response to the UN resolution regarding the possibility of developing a multidimensional vulnerability index. Next slide, please. So we will try to go quite fast and explain the idea that we had behind in terms of developing or discussing the possibility of having a multidimensional vulnerability index that reflect the reality of the SIDS. Our main objective was not to develop an MVI for the SIDS, but an MVI that reflect the reality of the SIDS, which was really highlighted during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So the background for us is in 1990, as you may know, UNDP launched the first Human Development Report and redefined the development beyond high-income countries. So and developed the Human Development Index. So the whole framework for us in working on this MVI was to take into account the work done by UNDP around the Human Development Index and propose to redefine vulnerability beyond low income. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go too much in details, but the background for us is the SIDS face all common complex social, environmental, and economic development challenges due to the unique context, geographical context. They are over-dependent on import, heavily dependent on tourism. Many SIDS have revenue superior of 30% of the GDP. Lack of diversification and heavy dependence on import makes SIDS vulnerable to supply chain disruption. And that's what's happening now, and of course to other external shock. Next slide, please. So SIDS economy predicted to contract between 8 to 15% in 2020, if it's not more. So with progress on 2030 agenda threatened, and even more urgent need for a recognition of their vulnerability and a need for development of multidimensional vulnerability index that reflect the unique context of the SIDS, in line with the Samoa pathway. This will enable appropriate responses to endemic challenges of the SIDS face, including access to concessional financing and debt restructuring, as mentioned in the midterm review of the Samoa Pathway political declaration. Next slide, please. So vulnerability indices. So there are a broad range of vulnerability indices, as mentioned by Professor Lino at the beginning of his presentation. And we have reviewed around 12 multidimensional vulnerability index before starting making our analysis. Some embedded resilience in vulnerability, other measure vulnerability as a multidimensional phenomenon. Some covers only SIDS, other apply to developing countries. Next slide. So we work first, after a long analysis, we work first on the EVI, which is composed of the two sub-indices, one of the economic vulnerability sub-index with the share of agriculture, remoteness and landlordness, merchandise export concentration, and instability of export and goods and services. The second one is in the environmental vulnerability sub-index, which is a share of population on low elevated cost zones, share of population living in dry lands, victim of disaster, and instability of agriculture production. So why EVI is one of the LDC categories? It's especially relevant for assessing the vulnerability SIDS, the vulnerability of the SIDS. Of the other 143 countries of which CDP calculated the EVI every 3 years is reviewed. So 9 of the top 25 most vulnerable are SIDS, and 20 of the top 50. Of the many vulnerability indices, only EVI is an official UN index. The benefit includes consistent coverage across 143 countries and a time. So we were trying to build the analysis based on a multidimensional vulnerability index that comprised the maximum of countries, like proposed previously by some colleagues. And the methodology agreed by CDP and reviewed by its every 3 years was an element which was very important for us for developing the MVI. Already used to assess the vulnerability of another group or the LDCs, and beyond the income criterion, exactly the needs for the small island developing states. Jacob?
Thank you very much. The last point Riyad made is very important for the access to concessional financing. Normally, this depends on income levels, GNI per capita, but as you can see in this figure, which has the EVI on the vertical axis and log of per capita income on the horizontal, most of the SIDS are more vulnerable than their income level would suggest. So that's already, the EVI itself is already a step in the right direction. Now, we wanted to build on that and add some of the lessons from COVID-19. The SIDS especially have been affected. The first step in UNDP was the launch of 2 dashboards analyzing countries' vulnerability and preparedness to pandemics and other global shocks. You can find them on our website. But from these, one of the most significant indicators of contraction in SIDS was in travel caused by the pandemic. Both restrictions and voluntary cancellations. So SIDS were particularly hit. And SIDS are depending on tourism, over 30% of total exports. They derive 42% of export revenues from inbound tourism, and it's the only group that scored high vulnerability in these dashboards. SIDS are also highly dependent on personal remittances, more than other developing countries, and they also have more FDI than other developing countries. And there's an interlinkage there between FDI and tourism, so global shocks like a pandemic can have a double impact on these countries, less export revenues and less FDI at the same time. And you can see here SIDS are the most dependent on tourism and remittances in all the country groupings. We considered other indicators. For example, biodiversity was early on suggested as an indicator. But thinking about it and looking at the literature, we realize it's not a direct measure of vulnerability of people, although it's part of the SDG agenda. And partly it depends on countries' natural endowment, so it's not really a variable that countries can control. For example, the top 4 countries in biodiversity are large countries, which happen to be endowed with good natural diversity. Also, statistically, we found that the biodiversity has a negligible significance using our principal component analysis. So overall, we decided to drop it. Debt, as mentioned by Professor Bergoglio, should not be included because that's one of the things you want to prove. But also, in this sense, debt is not specifically a source of vulnerability for SIDS. They have less debt than other developing countries and less debt service. So our fifth iteration of this index, we took the original 8 indicators of the EVI and we added 3 financial, what we call financial vulnerability indicators. Tourism as share of exports, remittances as share of GDP, and FDI as share of GDP. We did a principal component analysis. It neatly fell into these 4 categories. The weights were mostly equal, and we decided not to use statistical weights because it's easier to communicate equal weights, but they're pretty much equal anyway. And one benefit of this approach is that the 4 components are helpful to do a decomposition. So if you take a country like Tonga, it's not about whether it's vulnerable or not, it's more about where it is vulnerable. So Tonga is very vulnerable in financial and environmental dimension, moderately vulnerable geographically, and not vulnerable economically. And then further down, you can drill down and track the original values. So why is Tonga very financially vulnerable? Well, 52.4% of exports is tourism. Remittances account for 34% of GDP. Environmentally, it has high shares of victims of disasters and reliance on agriculture. But economically, it doesn't have very much export concentration, instability, or agriculture instability. So this is a tool for policy analysis also to drill down into details. And now we lost some countries from the EVI. We have 126 instead of 143, but we have 34 of the 38 SIDS. And here, if you compare EVI to MVI, SIDS are shown to be even more vulnerable with the MVI. 14 in the top 25 vulnerability table versus 28 compared to 20. Now, we also looked at the degree of vulnerability, and we grouped the countries into 4 quartiles of the MVI score. Countries below 21 on the MVI are low vulnerability overall. Only Barbados is in there. Medium vulnerability, only 8.5% are SIDS. But then when we come to high and very high, 50% of high vulnerability are SIDS and 87.5% of very high vulnerability are SIDS. Now this is similar to the previous chart, but the previous chart had EVI on the vertical axis. Here we have MVI, and you can see that instead of 10 countries under the line, you have 5. So even more SIDS are more vulnerable than their income alone would suggest. There's some changes. Some SIDS go over, some countries go under, but importantly, you can see that you can identify why. So Grenada increased its vulnerability because it's very highly dependent on tourism and FDI. St. Vincent, highly dependent on FDI and tourism. Suriname and Papua New Guinea became less vulnerable in this index because of the lack of dependency. However, at the bottom of the slide, you can see the biggest benefit of the MVI. SIDS on average increased their vulnerability ranking by 12 positions across the developing country distribution, and non-SIDS dropped by 4 positions. The MVI can be used, therefore, to assess countries' eligibility for concessional financing. And normally, non-least developed countries SIDS have much higher borrowing costs. So we did a little simulation, and we estimated that if IFIs use the MVI in addition to GNI per capita to assess eligibility, the average non-LDC SIDS would be able to save close to 1.5% of GDP if they got the same treatment based on the MVI. To conclude, we update the EVI using 3 dimensions that are part of financial vulnerability. The tool can help access concessional finance in 2 ways. In the short term, by addressing overwhelming debt burdens and sovereign rating downgrades. But in the long term, it can also help SIDS transform their economies and diversify them to meet the Agenda 2030 and the Samoa pathway. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So the main objective for us Of course, we know that there are some weaknesses, some strength of utilizing the MVI. There are some elements could be missing, for example, the social aspect. But by building a multidimensional vulnerability index, you cannot add everything. More you add, more you weaken your index, but also the possibility of finding the right database covering all the countries, including all the SIDS. We were able to have 34 UN members, SIDS UN members, which was the most important thing for us because we wanted to reflect the reality of the majority of the small island developing states. We tested many other indices that we wanted to include, but it was not really conclusive. So we are open, as is a discussion paper, we welcome all kinds of comments that will help us to continue to do analysis and to go more in depth in the analysis. Thank you very much for inviting us.